Hello everybody, welcome to the I Am IT Geek YouTube channel. My name is Shabazz Dan, I am the IT Geek. Welcome to what is episode 3 of my Migrating Workloads to the Cloud series. Just want to do a quick recap into episode 2 before we get started with this episode 3. For those that watch, if you remember, I covered migrating workloads into SharePoint, SharePoint Online specifically. So I did an overview of SharePoint migrations first of all, where I kind of took a closer look at planning, assessing and remediating any issues you've got with your on-premises file shares, then preparing your SharePoint Online and your OneDrive environment, and then going into the actual migration and how that would look. We then looked at different migration workload examples, so that included on-premises file shares to SharePoint libraries, using personal shares like your home drives or your My Documents or whatever, and migrating those into OneDrive, and then finally doing a standard SharePoint on-premises to SharePoint Online migration, so a like for like, if you will. And then we looked at the toolset. So the main tool that you use is the SharePoint migration tool. So we looked at reviewing the settings and assessing those of your server where you're going to install that tool, reviewing the tool settings themselves, and also understanding your identities or your permission levels especially. So that's quite important. As I mentioned in the video, you need to make sure the account you're using has the relevant access to all your shares. And again, we looked at some of the supported authentication methods. And then we went into a demo. So I'll put a link to that video in the description if you want to check that one out. Otherwise, let's get started with episode 3. So this week's episode, as I mentioned, which is episode 3, is all around migrating workloads into Azure Files. So a similar setup to last week, where we'll look at migrating workloads into Azure Files as an overview, look at some examples of workload migrations, look at some basics, the kind of Azure File migration basics, which I feel will be quite useful for people to know, and things that I've obviously learned in my experience. Then look at the tool set. There are more tools you can use, whereas remember with SharePoint online migrations, it was essentially one tool that you can use or you should use. There's a lot more tool sets for this type of migration, so especially with on-premises file shares to Azure Files, which is what we're kind of going to be concentrating on in this demo as well. And as I mentioned, we'll finish off with the demo, which is always a lot of fun. So yeah, let's get stuck in. So do a quick overview. Gives you simplified cloud deployment and migration. So as well as your standard file shares, as what we're going to show in the demo, Azure Files can also be used in numerous ways to simplify new cloud development projects. For example, shared application settings. So storing application settings within an Azure file share, similar to what you would do in WVD when you've got MS App attach. You can use Azure Files, Azure File shares for that type of use case, or a diagnostic share as well. It's a convenient place to for cloud applications to write their logs and metrics. So if you are using Azure Files or log analytics, like that, you can integrate that with Azure File shares as well. So it's use it as a diagnostic share. Finally, dev, test, and debugging. When developers or administrators are working on VMs in the cloud, they often need a set of tools or utilities. So copying these sort of utilities and tools to each VM, it can be time-consuming exercise. So having a central location, again, very similar to what you do on premises. Essentially, you'd mount an Azure file share in this instance, and then store those developer toolkits within there in that file share, and you can access them simply and quickly. So another benefit of Azure Files is the containerization that you get, and what this basically is, Azure File shares can be used as persistent volumes for stateful containers. And what this allows you to do is gives you that build once, run anywhere capability, for example, that developers use to accelerate innovation, for example. In this scenario, for the containers to access the raw data, at every start, they need a shared file system within the cloud, and it allows the containers to access the file system no matter which instance that they run on. So Azure Files is ideal for this sort of containerization use case, which is another really good reason to use it. So to finish off this section, let's have a quick look at some of the key benefits of Azure Files. So the first one is shared access. So with Azure Files, it supports SMB and NFS protocols, meaning you can seamlessly replace your on-premises file shares, which is essentially what we're going to be looking at in the demo. It's fully managed by Microsoft, so Azure File Shares can be created without the need to manage your hardware OS. We all hate patching. Don't care who you are, you hate patching. I know I hate patching. So having a service where you can, you just have a file share to access rather than having to worry about the OS and outages of your server, etc. It's fully managed, so that headache is taken away. Scripting and tooling, PowerShell commandlets, Azure CLI, these can be used to create, mount, and manage your Azure file shares. So if you don't want to use a GUI, if you're all about the the scripting life, then you can use PowerShell and other tools. And finally, resiliency. So this is apparent with anything in sort of public cloud, be it Microsoft or AWS. You can't compete with the amount of resiliency you get. You'd have to have multiple servers in multiple locations to compete. So, Azure Files has been built from the ground up to always be available. Replacing on-premises file shares with Azure Files means you no longer need to wake up to deal with those local power issues or network outages. So again, it's another massive key benefit. So next, going to take a look at some of the workload migration examples. So the first one being a replacement of your traditional on-premises file servers, which is essentially what we're going to be kind of showing in the demo. And what you've got here is, you've got Azure File Shares, which you can completely replace your file share servers. Especially your traditional sort of NAS devices as well. Operating systems like Windows, Mac, and Linux, they can actually mount the file share from Azure Files. So it takes away that need to have any sort of storage on your server if you want to mount that share on a file server. Or you can also use Azure File Sync to do like a sync from Azure Files onto an on-premises server or in the cloud. And what that allows you to do is increase your performance and enable distributed caching. And again, you can also integrate it with Azure AD and Azure File AD authentication. Azure Files SMB file shares, all that sort of stuff can continue to work with AD hosted on premises as well. So very hybrid, but also cloud only if that's where you want to go. So it looks, it can do both sort of workloads. So the next sort of example is lift and shift of your application. So, Azure Files can be used if you've got applications that need some sort of storage or file share, for example, to host their data or sort of analytics or logs on. Then you can use Azure Files for that. Now, there are obviously two forms you can have it. You can have it where you're doing your classic lift and shift where the application and its backend file share are moving to the cloud. Or you can have it where in more of a hybrid environment where the actual file share, you're wanting to move that to the cloud, so you'd use your Azure File Shares for that. But the actual application is going to stay on premises. So again, you can use it for both the sort of lift and shift of application scenarios there for a hybrid or for a fully cloud migration. The final example is VDI user profiles with Azure Files and FS Logics integration. So again, for those of you that do WVD, you'll know that you can utilize Azure File Shares with FS Logics for the user profiles. So this is another workload that you could migrate to, especially if you're using other VDI elements like RDS or Citrix or even the VMware Horizon. Being able to utilize Azure Files with FS Logics for user profiles is another great workload. And as I said, it's something I use quite regularly with Windows Virtual Desktop. So just another good example of workload migration that you can utilize. So I just want to touch on some Azure File Share Migration basics before we move on. So as we know, Azure has multiple available types of cloud storage, and a fundamental aspect of file migrations to Azure is determining the type of Azure storage option which is right for your data. So Azure File Shares, for example, they're more suitable for general purpose file data. So this data includes anything you use on premises like SMB or NFS shares for. With the Azure File Sync tool, you can cache the contents of several Azure File Shares onto your server, Windows server and on premises. So the key in any migration is to capture all the applicable file fidelity when moving your files from your current storage location to your Azure location. There are two basic file components of any file, and they are the data stream, so that's the data stream of a file store and the file contents, and also the file metadata. And the file metadata has kind of these sort of subcomponents, which are file attributes like read only, file permissions, so who has access to what and what level of access they have. Timestamps, so most notably the creation and last modified date you normally see, and finally an alternative data stream, which is like space to store larger amounts of your non-standard properties. So these are sort of the basic components of your file. And then now we move on to the type of deployment. So we've got a hybrid deployment / migration. So this is essentially, as I mentioned earlier, where you've got an on-premises file server, and what you want to do is you actually want to migrate the contents to a file share in the cloud. So in this case, Azure Files. But the applications or the access might still be from on-premises. So you want to keep a server on premises where your application might be, or etc. And then you want to mount that Azure file share onto your Windows server on premises. So that's sort of the hybrid deployment and migration. And then obviously we move on to a more cloud-only deployment and migration. This is where, example again, we've been applications where everything goes up to the cloud. So the application and the backend data. So we've got the backend data that goes into Azure file share, and then the application that might go into Microsoft Cloud somewhere, or it might even be the virtual machine that you migrate up to Azure and use the infrastructure side of it. Or again, you could go full throttle and do the whole file share up into Azure and just have users accessing it directly from the cloud, so you don't mount it on the server locally. So these are some of the Azure migration basics I wanted to touch on that I felt would be useful for everyone to hear. So let's move on to the next slide. So before we go into the demo, which I know is always the fun part, I wanted to quickly touch on the tool set. And as you can see already, a lot more tools available than what I personally experienced with the SharePoint migrations, which is just a SharePoint migration tool. So if we start off at the top, you can see RoboCopy is a supported and recommended tool. Azure File Sync, which I'm going to use in a demo, so we'll see that closely. So that's natively integrated into Azure File Shares. So personally for me, that's probably the best choice because it's a native tool, fully supported. And then as you can see, I won't go down the full list. Just want to touch on the bottom two, which is, even though they're supported, Azure Storage Explorer version 1.14 and upwards, and the Azure Data Factory, even though they are supported, they're not recommended. So that's just keep that in mind. And as I said, you can see there AZ Copy, Databox, and even the Storage Migration Service, all kind of recommended and supported, or even indirectly supported. But a whole list of tools there that you can use depending on what your preference is or your scenario is. And so without further ado, let's get stuck into the demo. It's always a fun part. So I've got some parts of it already provisioned, like always. So my file shares are already provisioned because I've kind of already shown that in previous videos how to provision file shares. So we're gonna provision the Azure File Sync, kind of that sort of service, install it on premises, and then do an example of how migration would look. So let's get stuck into it. Let's jump into the portal. So as you can see here, we have our Azure portal in my I Am IT Geek tenant. Just a couple of things I want to go through before I start deploying the actual storage sync service. So we've got a standard resource group with a VNet, and what we have then is the important bit, I suppose, for this demo, which is the storage account with a SMB file share. So straightforward. For the purpose of the demo, it's fully open, it's public. I've not locked it down to any networks, but again, it's recommended best practice to make sure you lock it down so only specific networks that need access to it can get access to it. I've not got Active Directory configured in this instance because I've just not got an Azure AD tenancy, but again, you can configure it with the domain controller. But again, all we're going to mimic here is going through the migration process. We're not going to mimic anything around Active Directory or any identity management. So that's my actual file share and my storage account. What I also have is I have a file server on premises, a virtual machine with some data, and I've done some sort of pre-configuration on that just to get it ready for the migration. But let's go ahead and go back to home. I want to deploy the storage sync service now. So let's go ahead and do that. So there are a few different ways you can deploy this service. You can either do it through the portal, through PowerShell or Azure CLI. For the purpose of demo, I'm just going to quickly do it through the portal. So go to home and then click create. And here we're going to type in Azure Files Sync. Type in Azure properly, miss the A out, and there it is. So we select that, and that should eventually take us to the configuration page. So for whatever reason, my portal had a bit of a hissy fit, so I had to refresh it. So here you can see we're at the Azure File Sync, and we're going to create. And here we have to put in some of the standard sort of basic details. So I'll go ahead and put my resource group, storage sync, the service name. I'll just call it Azure File Sync 01, and then the region. So we want to put this as close to where we are, so UK South, there you go. Again, add any tags that you want to add here. Again, for the purpose of the demo, I'm just going to click create, or review and create, should I say. Let that validate, and it should then create the deployment. And whilst that's creating, or once that's created, the next step will be to install the Azure File Sync agent on the on-premises server. So the deployment validation has succeeded there, so now it's going to start initiating deployment. Once this is complete, I'll jump onto the file server where I should already have downloaded the agent, and I'll install that, and we can go through those steps as well. So as you can see here, we have downloaded the agents. We downloaded it for Server 2012 R2, 2016 and 2019. For the purpose of a demo, as you can see, I've got a 2019 server. So I'm going to go ahead and install this. So again, we're going to go with the defaults. You know, we don't need to change anything. Just accept the terms and conditions. Choose the existing. There is no proxy settings, so use the Microsoft updates. Fine. Again, leave everything as default. Just go ahead and install it. Once this is installed, we are then going to have to register the Windows server with the storage sync service. So that's where we'll go back into the Azure portal to do that. So once this is installed in a couple of minutes, I'll jump back to the Azure portal. So before we go on to this, one little bit I missed out was the configuration of the sync service on the server. I forgot to press record, so I do apologize about that. But it's very much a next sort of GUI. And essentially you need to sign into your Azure portal. So once you've signed in, you select the subscription, the resource group, and the sync service that we've created. And then that will essentially connect your on-premises server to your Azure File Sync. And then from there, what we're going to do now is create a sync group. Let's just give it a name. Spell sync right, it would help. Make sure it's your subscription. Click on the storage account that we want to select. And from here, it's got our data file share, and then we click on create. So there you go, that's now created. And from here, we can just make sure my account has the relevant permissions. So I should be an owner of this. Yep, so I'm an owner, which is great. Once this is done now, the sync group's done, we can now create a server endpoint. So here we're in the Azure File Sync, or the sync service again. And what we want to do is we want to click on our sync group 01 here. And from here we want to add the server endpoint. So click on this, it should have our registered server already, which is great. And then we want to put in the path on premises. So for me it is C:\data. And then we have several options here, as you can see. So here we've got cloud tiering. So this is all around the tier of storage you're going to use. So if we enable that, we can select whether it's infrequently used or hot or cold storage. And it just allows us to use the different tiers of storage. And for the initial download, again, we'll leave it at default, but essentially this is an optional selection starting with agent version 11, I believe. And it can be helpful when there are files in the Azure file share but not on the server, so that isn't something that we have, so we're just going to leave that at default. And the final option that we can configure is offline data transfer, and again, we can enable that or disable it. But again, for the purpose of this demo, we don't have any, we're not using Azure Data Box or anything like that to transfer the data. So we're just going to leave that as it is and just click on create. And once this is configured, we should then be in a position to do some migrations, hopefully. Again, after this though, there's some point, depending on your network. Mine's a very basic network, so I don't really have any complicated firewalls or anything like that. They do recommend that you configure your firewalls both on premises and on in Azure, and your virtual network settings as well. So again, because I'm opening everything up to public for the purpose of a demo, I'm not going to be locking it down to anywhere. So yeah, we can move on to onboarding with Azure File Sync next. So by configuring the Azure File Sync, the sync group, and on top of that the service endpoint, or the server endpoint should I say, that has then automatically initiated the file sync from on-premises to Azure Files. So if we're in this, as you can see, we're in the Azure File Sync. Let's click on the sync group. And here you go, this basically tells us, look, there's a file server and the upload has been initiated. Let's just click on, we see there's a graph here as well which shows us what's going on. Click on here for some more details, and there you go, the last status, it shows us a local path, and here we've got an update to the sync activity, so it's doing the initial upload at the moment, it's calculating. So again, this is all very dependent on the upload speed and the amount of data. I've got a fair bit of data that I've selected, and also my upload speed is pants. It's very slow, so it's gonna take a while, but essentially what we've done is here we've shown the process of setting up your Azure File Sync and using the sync agent with an on-premises server. So that's essentially what I wanted to show you in the demo. So it's obviously going to take ages to upload everything, so I'll probably stop this, but I hope you now understand the process of setting this up and what your requirements are. So what we'll do now is we'll finish the demo and go back to the presentation. So I just want to quickly go through a summary of what we've done in this episode. So we had a look at an overview of migrating workloads into Azure Files, where I covered some of the kind of high level attributes of it. I then looked at some workload migration examples, so doing a sort of migrating application data that needs a file share, or looking at Windows file shares into Azure Files, or even VDI user profiles if you remember. Then looked at some more migration basics around Azure Files. Looked at some of the tool set then, so we looked at Robocopy, Azure File Sync Agent, which is what we used, as well as some of the unsupported tool sets. And finally, just went through a demo of how to set up Azure File Sync Agent and allow that to sync up from on-premises up to Azure Files. So that's the episode done. Thank you very much for watching. Again, this is the sort of piece that I'm doing in this series, which is around migrating workloads. So this is, again, I've covered another sort of file share workload up into Azure. So my plan is next to cover sort of the Exchange elements, so emails, Exchange on premises, migration up to Exchange Online using the Microsoft native tools. So that's going to be a 2-part episode, so keep an eye out for that. I've also got my podcast recording that I did with the amazing Sarah Lean. That's all been done, and hopefully that should be released in a couple of weeks as well. So please, do like and share the video. And please, if you've not already subscribed, please subscribe. Drop me a comment if you've got any questions. But if nothing else, apart from please do share my content. So until next time, thank you and goodbye.